Okay, we're looking at Ruth, and we touched on some of this last week, Ruth 1 and 2. We're going to deal with this a little bit more in detail based upon what the booklet we're using asks us, as well as make sure we get the type-annotype and look at the overall picture of this book, which is more than just an interesting love story. There's so much significance to it. Boaz here is pictured as the Lord of Harvest, and we need to recognize that chapters 1 and 2, the focus from beginning to the end is on the barley harvest, which in the Old Testament system had to do with the Passover. Of course, Christ is going to die in the Passover, and the Passover lamb will be offered up. And then chapters 3 and 4 talks about the wheat harvest, and that is the Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, the Feast of First Fruits, where you have the giving of the Holy Spirit and salvation comes. So this is all about redemption. It fascinates me that I think we all could agree that the most important event in the entire Bible is creation itself, right? But we don't have really that many chapters in the Bible on creation. In fact, the book of Genesis deals with 457 Hebrew words to describe the first 6 days. Very concise, kind of moves right on, doesn't try to defend it. And there's a couple of chapters about creation in the Psalms, and in a few other places it refers back to it. But how many chapters in the Bible deal with the theme of redemption? I mean, it's like most all the Bible in some way or other ties back to redemption, the new creation, right? And that's what we find here, is this is one of these prophetic books that, as we mentioned last week, in the Jewish prophets listed it in the writings, the way they divided up the Old Testament with the prophetic letters, rather than putting it in with the Psalms and the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and that kind of stuff. So they saw this as prophetic, and for very, very good reason. And you remember Elimelech, which was married to Naomi, they fled to Moab because of the famine. And how long did they stay there? About 10 years. And they go over there with their two sons, who marry Moabite women, which, by the way, was not condemned in the book of Deuteronomy. The 7 Canaanite nations you couldn't marry. The Moabites were not a part of that because they weren't Canaanite. Yes?
I read a note that nowhere in Judges are we told there was ever a famine during that period of time. But here in Ruth we hear about it.
Yeah. There's clearly lots of demonstrations of the curses of the covenant. And the one that's focused on in Judges is the Canaanites that they intermarried with, and that they had become their servants, and that they were becoming like. So that was a part of the theme. But you're right, this shows us that there was pretty serious famines, which you would expect because there was so much unfaithfulness. So that's a good thought, Les. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so why is Ruth called the Cinderella of the Old Testament? If you're familiar with the story of Cinderella, she was a very beautiful stepchild of the queen, who mistreated her and all that kind of stuff. And she always had dreams of greatness. And of course, as the story ends, she winds up going to the ball, and the prince is enamored with her, and she got all dressed up, and then of course she leaves her shoe behind. Yes?
She was a daughter of a queen. The daughter of a queen?
Yeah, wasn't she the stepdaughter?
Of a queen?
I think so.
A royal.
Do I not have my fairy tales right?
A royal, not
A royal?
Royal.
She was a stepdaughter.
Look, I just watched this.
All right. Well, I haven't, when I start spending more time with the grandkids, I'll probably get more familiar with Cinderella again. But
Okay.
Okay, all right. Mistreated, beautiful stepdaughter. Okay.
Josephus had something to say about it.
Really? I'm not so sure that Josephus certainly predated Cinderella. But at any rate, I like that title for her because the idea was is Cinderella was so unlikely to ever be able to be a princess. And that's certainly also true of Ruth. Her name means beautiful or desirable. And she's a most unlikely heroine and candidate for greatness in a Jewish love story. Why is that the case? Why would you not expect to find her in a Jewish love story?
She wasn't a Jew.
Yeah, that's the first thing. She's a Gentile, and she is a Moabitess because, Elimelech's son married these Moabite women, and then, of course, she follows Naomi and is convicted and dedicated to her and is very loyal and loving. And this is going to really impress Boaz because this is so unusual. And he calls this her first kindness. And then he talks about the second kindness. And we'll talk about that next week when we get into chapter 3 and 4. But she's very unlikely to be put in this position, so common of the Bible, where you have things that are kind of not what you would expect. She is a childless widow in a foreign land, and she is totally destitute. She came from Moab with nothing but the dress on her back, and she's on welfare. How do we know she's on their welfare system? Yeah, she's gleaning the edges of the field, which was only designed for the destitute. And we're going to talk a little bit more about something that people often forget. The other thing I think is really neat to show God's providence in all of this is in Ruth chapter 2. It says, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean among the ears of the grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. She said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came out and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened, or her hap was, is the way the American Standard says, to light on the portion of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was the family of Elimelech. So as they set this up, she didn't intentionally choose this field. It says happened. And I think that's significant because throughout the Old Testament, that kind of thing frequently comes up. Rabbis say that coincidence is not a kosher word. Yes, go ahead.
I don't see it as coincidence because she tells her mother-in-law, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, whose sight I may find favor. So it looked like she had a plan to...
Well, yeah, she had certainly had hoped that that would be the case, but the next verse seemed to indicate that she starts gleaning, and it was, she happened upon that field. So, her plan worked out because the first field she happened upon was the right one. So, how is Boaz a type of Christ? I alluded to this before, and I want to make sure we have this in mind, particularly as we go through this account, because I think this is really important. He's the real hero of the story here. What does his name mean again?
In him is my strength.
Yes, in Jehovah or in him is my strength. And Solomon thought that was so important that he is going to erect something in the temple that he's going to name Boaz. More about that in a minute. And of course, where does this whole story take place? What is the setting? Yeah, Bethlehem. That kind of has messianic implications, doesn't it? Remember, Bethlehem was a small little village 17 miles outside of Jerusalem, and yet it's mentioned so many different ways throughout the Bible because this is where Christ is going to be born, in the house of bread, of course, Bethlehem, Judah. And so this is going to connect Boaz and his family and Obed and all of that to Judah and eventually the Davidic line. And he's going to be the kinsman redeemer. He voluntarily redeems her for love. He does this because he wants to. He doesn't have to. And more about that in a minute. And Boaz here is pictured as the bridegroom, this Lord of harvest, faithful and true. And he meets both Naomi's and Ruth's every need. And so, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the whole book of Ruth focuses in on the Passover and the Pentecost, the barley harvest, and then the wheat harvest. And at the end, he takes on a Gentile bride. And in the law of gleaning that we alluded to last week, where it talks about that you weren't supposed to go back over the fields twice, and you weren't supposed to do the corners, and it says that that was there for those that were widows, orphans, people who didn't have anybody to take care of them. So that was the right thing to do. It was a way to give someone food without making them beg. And I thought that was really a way to give them dignity. And yet they also had to put some of their own effort into it, right? They had to wait, go out, find these things, and then, of course, finish the job, which it stresses that she did after she got the gleaning. Now, this was a special provision for the kinsmen of Israel, which means that technically a Moabite sister-in-law didn't have to get this provision. But he sees this, his heart goes out toward her. He knew about her kindness to Naomi. She was obviously very attractive, and he wanted to make sure not only that she could partake in this, but that she get extra. Didn't want her to go to other people's fields. So what does this show about Boaz and the way he provides for the needs of Ruth? It's not a matter of the law. It's grace. He does, it's unmerited favor. And Jesus, of course, gives us lavish, abundant grace. And later on, when in our study, we're going to be looking at 1st and 2nd Kings, and this is often forgotten when you study Boaz, but he comes up again. It shows you how important that Solomon thought about Boaz. He's named, he's one of the 2 pillars of the temple. It's named after Boaz, 1 Kings 7:15 through 24. So any of the pictures you see of the Solomon's temple, you'll see as you walk in, there's these 2 major brazen columns. And you can see here, it's all laid out in 1 Kings. And one was to be named Boaz, because in him is strength, which is what Boaz's name means, right? And the other is named Sheshan, which is he shall establish. So the idea is he's like the foundation, the support. He's the pillar, and it all comes from God. And this was done in honor, in part, of Boaz. Yes?
It shows that Solomon obviously knew some family history to go back 2 or 3 generations.
Oh, yes. Well, they knew the Old Testament. And this was an important part of the prophetic writings. And they recognized what a hero and how gracious and kind Boaz was. Boaz was wealthy. Solomon is going to be the wealthiest man in the world of his time. He gets to build the temple. David made the preparations. Took him about 7 years to build. Massive building project. 2 huge pillars, one called Boaz and the other Jason, which I think is pretty cool. Yes?
Who's Jason?
You know what? I don't believe that he's actually a historical character, but it is the name of he shall establish, which is the idea of a foundation. So I don't know if he was an actual historical character like Boaz or not, but that's what the 2 pillars as you walk into the temple.
I think he just picked it because of the name meaning.
Perhaps, but I think it's pretty hard to not think that he's very much aware of the importance of Boaz in his own history.
Yeah.
So, I mentioned to you last time, after we introduced all of this, thought questions for next week. How does the kinsman redeemer law of Leviticus 25, 47 through 50, and the law of redemption prove to be messianic? And we're not going to have time tonight to talk about the 5 things Naomi tells Ruth to do, because that's in chapters 3 and 4. But I want you to look at that, and I want you to be aware. I just love how all these things fit together so well. Boaz represents Christ, and I think Naomi ultimately represents Israel. And Israel's going to come back from captivity, and she's going to be somewhat bitter after all the losses that she had in the past. But ultimately, through Boaz, the Messiah, the Redeemer, she's going to be blessed. And I want you to think about Ruth here as representing the church. She's the Gentile bride that Christ is going to have. And who is it that's instructing her and teaches her about God? Naomi. And if we're right in this, and Naomi represents Israel, how do we ultimately learn about God and salvation and the idea of redemption and the Messiah from the Old Testament, from ancient Israel? In fact, in Deuteronomy, as well as in Exodus, he tells the nation that the whole nation is going to be a kingdom of priests. Now, at first glance, you can go, wait a minute, the Levites was the priest. You had to be, from the Levitical priesthood in order to be a priest. But also, the whole nation of Israel is considered to be a priest. Now, remember, what do priests do? They are the means by which you can reach God. And why do we spend so much time studying the Old Testament? Because it's through physical Israel that we learn about spiritual Israel. And it was God's plan to have, in many ways, the whole nation that was supposed to be a holy priesthood, right? Holy people, a royal priesthood, that we learn so many things that are foreshadowed that God had planned for everyone, Jew or Gentile. And so notice the clear instruction in how Ruth listens carefully to what Naomi tells her, and that's how she's going to, in part, successfully approach Boaz and win over Boaz's heart, and they wind up joining and becoming one, getting the blessings of the Jewish Messiah, even though she's Gentile. So I think that's pretty cool. And next week, I want us to look at the 5 things that Naomi tells Ruth, and you can just see the spiritual parallels as to how we need to approach Jesus in order to have him be our bridegroom, faithful and true. So this law of redemption, this is found in Leviticus 25, 47 through 50. And I was rereading that this afternoon, and the focus in the Levitical account is actually on someone who was so destitute that they offered themselves up as an indentured servant. It also applied if you offered up your land for payment, for collateral. And it talks about how the day of Jubilee after 50 years, where everybody has to forgive all the remaining debts, fits into all of that. It's a fascinating reading. I hope you took some time to do that. But if someone winds up being an indentured servant and has to leave their home and work off a debt, there's all these provisions made for redemption, which of course is a very important theme throughout the Bible. And there were 3 requirements for someone to come in to somebody who has this servant who, this isn't slavery like we often picture it, where people are kidnapped and beaten and mistreated. Kidnapping was a capital crime. The old law completely forbade any kind of kidnapping someone and force them to work for you. But very common in the ancient world is sometimes for room and board, you would agree to be someone's hired servant. Or if you borrowed a bunch of money and the only way you could pay it back is by agreeing to be their hired servant, That was the honorable thing to do. So most of the time when the Bible talks about servants, and sometimes unfortunately they use the word slave, we get all these connotations, and some people will really criticize the Bible because, you know, it looks like the Bible is sanctioning slavery. No, the Bible doesn't sanction that kind of slavery, but it does allow you to pay off a debt by working for someone. In fact, a very famous account of that in the Old Testament was Jacob, who left with, you know, a pillow for his head, which was a stone. And what did he have to do to pay the dowry for Rachel and Leah? Yeah, 7 years apiece, 14 years total. And so that was very common, all right? So what happens if, you know, one of your relatives gets in a bind and does that? There's all these rules and provisions for somebody that can come and say, I'm going to redeem this person. I'm going to pay off their debt so they can be set free, right? And there were 3 specific requirements that were involved in this. I'm not really sure why this is, because why some person that just wanted to be kind couldn't step in and do it. But here you had to be a near kinsman. Had to be somebody who was in the family. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact this was often also had to do with liens on property so that you could redeem the property, which would have been in the family. But anyway, you had to be a near kinsman. You had to, of course, be able to do it. You had to have the means. The Levitical writer says, maketh yourself rich in the land, which you worked hard and you worked in the field and you worked long hours and you were blessed, then you were a good steward. And one of the ways you could use your blessings was to bail out a relative that's gotten themselves in trouble. Be a kind thing to do. So you had to be a near kinsman. You had to be able, they call that a vindicator. But just because you're able, just because you got the money, it wasn't required. You couldn't go to this person and insist. The other person had to be willing. And in so doing, they come up as the person that is graciously, really without any obligation, restoring you back to what you had. Yes, Pat.
Also, the person that with the closer kinsman turned it down because he didn't want to endanger his own estate.
Yeah. This is an account where Boaz was close through Rahab and all that, but there was somebody who was even closer. So you had to give them the first right of refusal, is what they.
Something about that estate, like his kids couldn't inherit it if she had children.
Yeah, you know, we're going to talk about that next week. There are reasons why this guy maybe didn't want to do it. And one of them had to do with diluting his own estate and sharing this then with the other children. You know, you also have the Levirate law, which is talked about also in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Anybody know what that provision was in the Old Testament? Called the Levirate law. Okay. Yes. Yeah, if you're let's say your older brother marries and he's childless and he dies and he's left a young widower, then if you're a younger brother and you haven't married yet, you're then supposed to go ahead and marry your sister-in-law. It's very interesting because the Levitical code says that you can't marry your sister-in-law. It was considered a violation of sexual norms. But in this case, you were supposed to. This was an exception. And the reason given is that you would then have a child by your older brother's wife or former wife, so that you could then have that child or children by her and raise up seed in the name of your brother. So not just that his name would not die in Israel, but that so that he could maintain the land grant rights that were given back in the time of Joshua. And that was a sacrificial thing to do because unlike today where people are always worried about, can we afford to have very many kids? And they're worried about having all these mouths to feed. It used to be they were, a blessing, and they were, more hands to work in the fields. And the more children, the better almost. In fact, the ideal family back in the old days was 10, 7 sons and 3 children, 3 daughters, which is, by the way, the number that Job had. So anyway, you're giving up some of your children to help your brother maintain his share of the land grant. So, that was always in their mind, because they were slaves before and were penniless and had nothing, and then God gives them the land of promise. Okay, I see the wheels turning. Did I say something?
No, I was just going to add to it.
All right, go ahead and add to it.
Yeah, you mentioned how concerned people are with having lots of kids. So I was also thinking incompatibility with your spouse. That seems to be the last thing on their mind. Yeah, you just marry your brother's wife.
Yeah.
If you don't get along, you'll figure it out.
Well, somehow or other, they just figured out how to get along a lot better. Yes, go ahead.
It used to be like that in our country, an agrarian,
Yeah, much more the parents arranged.
In my mother's family.
Yeah.
All worked in the fields and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, by the way, you guys know Isaac Gleemaker. He's a nice young man, just obeyed the gospel. I've been studying with he and Selena regularly. And he said he has 9 siblings. And you talk about having a wedding and they're trying to get all their family. They go, look, we have a large wedding if we just have our immediate family and their spouses there and their children. So it's going to be a big event, I think. But that's unusual to have 9 siblings. Yes, Elijah.
Piggyback on what Chase was saying, and I think when we look through the eyes of our culture, the way that we view marriage is very different from how marriage was viewed then. There was a much higher sense of commitment. And I mean, you look at Isaac and Rebecca, like how much time did they spend getting to know each other? It was immediate. And it's not the way that we typically approach it. And I look at the way our culture is they approach relationships like leasing a car, and they try it out. And then after they've tried it out for a bit, if they like it, then they'll buy it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why divorce is so high, is because of that mentality of approaching it from a compatibility standpoint. And there's something to be considered with that.
Yeah, well, in the case of Isaac and Rebekah, it's fascinating. The text says that, Abraham sent off the servant, and God pointed out, I want you to marry basically a believer from the family of Haran. And so she comes down all excited, and he sees her coming down off the hill, and it's this dramatic moment, and it's kind of like their eyes meet. And so here it is. Here's my, knight in shining armor. And then they get married, and then it says, they go into the tent together and cohabitate. And then it says they learn to love each other. And that's the exact opposite of what we usually do. We have courtship, we fall in love, we decide, okay, this is who I want, then we propose. And then after you've fallen in love, then you get married. And it is interesting how the commitment came first, and out of that commitment came their love. And so Love American Style hasn't worked out too well, sadly. And a lot of it's because people get married with the idea in mind, if it doesn't work out, I can always get divorced. There isn't that commitment to, we're going to make this work one way or the other. And that's makes a big deal, makes a big difference when that's the case. Okay, I didn't expect us to get off into the weeds, but that was a good discussion there, and appreciated that. And of course, how does this fit with Christ? I mean, again, I preached whole sermons just on the 3 aspects here of how this is fulfilled in Christ. He is our kinsman redeemer. What makes him our kinsman? He's God, but he also what? Yeah, he's God-man. He became one of us. Why is it that the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin? It's apples and oranges, right? I mean, animals don't have souls like you and I do. They're not eternal spirit beings. So killing an animal is not the equivalent of paying for our sins. But Jesus could come as a Son of Man, as God-man, and he could be accepted as human, and it'd be a perfect apples and apples comparison. So that's why it's so important he becomes one of us. And I always think it's amazing that really God didn't send just a prophet. He didn't send a song. He sent himself through birth canal as our kinsman. And so he becomes the Emmanuel, God with us. So Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. And the other qualification is you have to be able. So what did Jesus have to do to be able? Live a perfect life, be sinless. That's why he's our hero. By the way, I'm not suggesting that Boaz here is perfect. He's not, he's human. But there are no flaws mentioned about Boaz in this story. And I think the reason is, again, he's clearly a type of Christ. He's the kinsman redeemer. He's able. And not only is he able, but he's more than willing. I mean, this isn't done grudgingly. He is the restorer. And so Naomi left and lost everything. She comes back 10 years later, and she's purchased back through Ruth, and then they have this beautiful wedding and this little baby, Obed, through which there's all this blessing and joy at the end. And that's what we have when we come to Christ. So isn't it beautiful how God is foreshadowing all of these things to make people understand and appreciate what it means when we say Christ is our Redeemer, right? He is the near kinsman. He's the vindicator. And he's the one that restores us. And it's all pictured in chapter 3 and 4 of Ruth. And with all this, it's amazing that so many Jews missed it. And then so tied to tradition that they'd rather, dogmatically hold on to what they were familiar with and what they'd been taught for 1,500 years under the law of Moses, that they would hold on to the shadow to reject the reality. Okay, so briefly describe how Naomi came to find herself in dire straits. Somebody want to summarize that, verses 1 through 5? Because of a famine, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, which means Jehovah is my king. So this was a righteous man, I'm pretty sure. And their 2 sons went to live in Moab. The 2 sons took Moabite wives, but later Elimelech and the 2 sons died. Boy, wouldn't that be tragic? And especially in a day where that's your means by which you can be taken care of. Leaving Naomi and her daughters-in-law with no one to provide for them. All right? What were the 2 scenarios that Naomi considered as the future for her daughters-in-law? Yeah, the first one was, okay, you're my daughters-in-law. I understand you can leave me and find Moabite husbands. You're still young enough to get married. And then I'll just go back home to Bethlehem by myself. And Ophrah decided, okay, I'll accept that. But they felt bad about Naomi. How's Naomi going to survive? And so that's where Ruth comes in and says, no, I'm not going to leave you. And then there's some thought at that point of maybe Naomi would marry and provide sons for them. Thought that was interesting. As far as we can tell, Naomi did not remarry. What 5 declarations did Ruth make to Naomi, followed by an oath and affirming her intention to go with her? We talked about this last week. Often mentioned in wedding ceremonies. Beautiful, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. That's really important. In other words, I'm going to believe and trust in Jehovah. And she makes this oath by Jehovah, not Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. Where you die, I will die and be buried. So, wow, this is quite a commitment that this Moabite sister-in-law makes to her mother-in-law. That's an unusual union, isn't it? What do you think motivated her, this is a reference to Ruth, to make this position, to make this commitment to Naomi? She was under no real moral obligation to necessarily make this commitment. Yeah, it must have been. The only thing that could be caused her to declare a desire to go with Naomi would have been Naomi herself. That is, Naomi had to have been of such character that she not only caused Ruth, and to some extent Oprah, because she even followed out a long distance, and she obviously had second thoughts about whether she really wanted to leave her, and Oprah, I think, felt better about, well, at least you'll have Naomi with you, and to serve Jehovah, and to trust in the God that no doubt Naomi and Elimelech, and maybe their faithful husbands, had told them about, right? Yes?
Well, the two daughter-in-laws probably saw their husbands and her father-in-law, what kind of people they were too.
Yeah, exactly right. So again, Elimelech, just by his name, is pictured to be a righteous man who just had no choice because of the famine to leave. Even though you've got this inheritance, this land, if there's a famine and you can't get any crops to grow, you go somewhere where there's rain, right? Okay. What sacrifices did Ruth make in deciding to return with Naomi? What was so significant about her oath? Well, I just answered that one, didn't I?
She left her people.
Yeah. Ruth was willing to give up her culture. Remember, they came to Moab. She's never been anywhere else as far as we can tell. Her family, nothing really is said about the rest of her family. Her friends, it's not easy to pull up roots. Everything that was familiar to her. Her God or gods, to some extent her identity, to live in a foreign land with foreign customs and possibly a foreign tongue. The people of Moab spoke a different language than the Israelites did. And of course, she made this oath in the name of Jehovah. All right. Upon their arrival in Bethlehem, what did Ruth propose that she do? Was this stealing? Why or why not? Of course, we talked about this. What was the proposal? Yeah, they got a provision in our land. We're not mean. Jehovah said, you know, you came out of Egypt. You used to be slaves. You be kind to your kinsmen. People sometimes get in circumstances where they're indigent, and they were especially concerned about the widows and the orphans. In fact, there was a provision in the old law, if you stole money from anyone, rich or poor, you had to pay it back like fourfold. You had to make restitution. They didn't throw you in prison. Remember, they didn't have a prison system in the Old Testament. Not in God's original plan, which just fascinates me. But they did have a system of fines. But what happened if you were caught stealing from a widow or an orphan? Yeah, that was a capital crime. So this was not stealing as it was authorized in the old law, as a way of providing for widows and the poor. What can you see in the events of chapter 2, 3 through 7 that hinted at Ruth's quality of character? She's already made this commitment not to leave Naomi out to dry. What do you think? She's determined to help provide for herself and Naomi in an honorable manner. And she's not going to just leave Naomi out to dry. Secondly, she is courteous to the workers. And when they come back, the whole town is talking about it. Wow, Naomi's back. Elimelech's died. The two children are died. But she came back with one of these sisters-in-law, and boy, is she a beauty. And she's a worthy woman. That was the reputation that Boaz said that Ruth had. Yes?
Ruth had grown up in Moab with their religion and their gods and so forth. Obviously, she had been taught about Jehovah and the Jewish laws and the Jewish customs and so forth. And so, that also shows that Naomi was a woman of the scriptures, I think, and was able to teach her daughter-in-laws.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Did you have a comment to make, Pat?
I did. First of all, I'm not so sure that there was emphasis on her physical beauty. I don't find that there, but what I do find is the foreman said that she was a hard worker, and she'd been there since morning, and that was impressive to Boaz. That she'd been
And her first kindness, which I think had to do with her commitment to Naomi.
right. I think that was more emphasized than her physical beauty.
Well, sure.
The only thing we have about the beauty is her name.
Yeah. And since she was named that at birth, you don't know for sure, I guess, what they're going to turn out. But all the rabbinical writings and the scholars, they seem to feel that Ruth was quite a catch. Thirdly, she asked permission to glean the fields, and I think maybe part of that was because she was a Gentile. Fourthly, she seemed to be really diligent in her efforts, and she's helping Naomi and all that. So we can at least say for certain this woman is beautiful on the inside, right? Okay. All right, so what 4 general instructions did Boaz give Ruth, and what reason did Boaz give for instructing Ruth so? Anybody want to look at chapter 2, 8 and 9? Someone want to read that for us? Go ahead, Les, you have it?
So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the fields where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled."
Don't be afraid of my young men. So you are a widow, and apparently he was concerned for her safety, and he's kind, and
We know that he had hired very honorable men too.
yes, yeah. And he was a very honorable man. As I said, I think a very eligible bachelor for sure. Boaz had heard of Ruth's devotion to Naomi, even at the cost of her native land. He also recognized that Ruth had abandoned her idolatrous life and sought protection from the Lord. So he wanted to take care of her. Yes?
But in the same way, we get to know people and know that they're seekers and so forth, and that they would accept studying the truth and committing to it. That's one way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Les. Good thoughts. Later on, what did Boaz do for her, and what instructions did he give his servants?
Leave some extra.
Yeah, he's going to go above and beyond. Boaz gave food to her to eat when it was mealtime, and he told his servants, hey, by the way, let her essentially reap and not just glean, and not to chastise her for doing it. He also told them to even pull out some bundles and leave it on the ground for her to take. Earlier, he indicated that he had told his young men not to touch her. So he's looking out for her and Naomi indirectly in more ways than one.
I think that kind of a statement could also indicate that she was probably very pretty too.
Yeah, yeah. He was at least making sure the men didn't bother her.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the reason why women spend so much time worrying about their looks is because they learned a long time ago that most men can see better than they can think, right? We're visually oriented. All right, how long did she work that day? What 2 things did she take to Naomi? Ruth gleaned until evening, which would be sunset, and then beat out what she had gleaned, surely a full day's work. That was back then. They didn't have the equipment we do now. They talk about the threshing floor and beating them down and lifting them up in the wind and separating the wheat from the chaff. She took barley she had gleaned, about an ephod, as the roasted grain that was left over from her meal in the field. So True or false? Ruth continued her gleaning through the end of the barley harvest. Yeah, I think the answer is true. Our author put false because it goes on and talks about she also gleaned through the wheat harvest. But she also did it through the barley harvest. So Gail and I had true. Naomi felt that it was a mistake for Ruth to work with the servants of Boaz. That's false. Naomi knew that was a safe place, and again, through Boaz's reputation. When Naomi and Ruth came into Bethlehem, everyone took notice. Absolutely. Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem because she had heard the famine had lifted. That's true, and they'd been there about 10 years. Okay, so now we move on to the wheat harvest, and next time we'll look at Ruth 3 and 4. And again, notice what Naomi tells Ruth to do, very unusual kind of set of events, to try to get Boaz to propose. In fact, it looks like she proposes to him, kind of, but she certainly makes it clear she's available and interested, right? So look at Ruth 3 and 4 next week, and then I'll give you some more handouts and a syllabus between now and the end of September, okay? All right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your feedback.